question is, what will you do? It's a question that Pilate asked, and the text of the lesson is taken from Matthew chapter 27, verses 22 through 26. What will you do with Jesus? Pilate responded, then what should I do with Jesus, who's called the Messiah? They shouted back, crucify him. Why? Pilate demanded. What crime has he committed? But the mob roared even louder, crucify him. Pilate saw that he wasn't getting anywhere and that a riot was developing. So he sent for a bowl of water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, I'm innocent of this man's blood. The responsibility is yours. And all the people yelled back, we will take responsibility for his death, we and our children. So Pilate released Barabbas. He ordered Jesus flogged with a lead-tipped whip, then turned him over to the Roman soldiers to be crucified. I made a note in the handout that some ancient manuscripts for this passage, Matthew 16 and 17, have the full name of Barabbas as Jesus Bar Abbas, which when translated would read, Jesus, Son of the Father. Interesting that the crowd would ask Jesus, Son of the Father, to be released instead of Jesus Christ, the Messiah. You see, church, the most famous trial in all of history is about to start. And the judge, as best we know from material written during the period of time, is short, he's aristocratic, but he has these really darting eyes and very expensive clothes. But he's apprehensive. Pilate is nervous about being thrust into these very exigent circumstances that he simply, today, can't avoid. Two soldiers lead him down the stone stairs of the fortress into this very wide courtyard. And there's probably shafts of morning light coming down and stretching across the stone floor. And as he enters, the Syrian soldiers, who are kind of dressed in short togas, yank themselves and their spears to attention. And they then stare straight ahead. And the floor on which they are standing is this mosaic of broad, brown, smooth stones. And on the floor, actually, are carvings so that the soldiers can play games while they're awaiting Pilate's sentence of that particular trial person. But in the presence of Pilate, the procurator, they're not playing any games. And a regal chair is now placed on a landing that is 5 steps up above from the stone floor. And the magistrate now takes his seat. The accused is brought into the room and placed below him. And what we know from Scripture is a covey of robed religious people are all following, and they walk over to one side of the room where they stand. And Pilate looks at the lone figure standing in front of him. Doesn't look like a Christ to me, he mutters. His feet are swollen and muddy, his hands are tan, his knuckles are all lumpy. He looks more like a laborer than a teacher. Looks even less like a troublemaker to him. One eye is black, perhaps, and swollen shut, and the other looks at the floor. His lower lip is split and scabbed. His hair is like blood matted to his forehead. His arms and his thighs are streaked with crimson from the blood that he just got done enduring with the beating before the flogging. And in my mind's eye, I can just see one of the soldiers saying, shall we remove the garment? No, Pilate would say, that's not necessary. It's obvious what the beating before the trial has done. So, are you King of the Jews? Pilate asked Jesus. And for the first time, I'm imagining Jesus' eyes lift up and look at Pilate. Maybe he doesn't raise his head, he just lifts his eyes. And he peers at the procurator from beneath his brow. And Pilate, I'm imagining, is probably a little surprised by the tone of Jesus' voice. Because here's what Jesus says. Those are your words. And before Pilate can even begin to respond, the knot of the Jewish leaders who are there mocking the accused, and at the side of the courtroom they're saying, see, he doesn't have any respect for you at all. He stirs up the people. He claims to be a king. But I'm thinking Pilate probably doesn't even really hear them, because Pilate is thinking, those are your words. No defense from the accused, no explanation, no panic. And maybe Jesus again looks at the floor, and Pilate is looking at the Jewish leaders that are huddled in their little corner of the courtroom. And I'm thinking that from Pilate's perspective, it must just really anger him. You know, the lashes aren't good enough. The mockery is inadequate. And he's probably thinking, you're just a bunch of jealous religious types. Maybe jealous buzzards, the whole obstinate lot of you. I'm imagining for you, church, some of the things that might have been going through Pilate's head, but it seems reasonable for me to have that kind of thinking going on with the procurator who is looking at the accused Jesus. Because we know what the rest of the story says. Pilate wants to let Jesus go. Just give me a reason, maybe he's thinking to himself. Just give me a reason, and I'll be happy to set you free. And then we know his thoughts are interrupted. Perhaps a tap on the shoulder. A messenger maybe leans in and whispers. And he's thinking, well, this is strange. Because Pilate's wife has just sent word to Pilate to not get involved in this particular case. Something about a dream that she had. At that point in time, Pilate apparently would walk back to the chair and sits and stares at Jesus, and he probably is muttering to himself, even the gods are on your side. I just heard from my wife. She said, don't deal with you. And Pilate sat in this chair many times before. And it's a very cruel seat. We know that it's made from this kind of cobalt blue with thick, ornate legs. It's the traditional judgment seat for the Roman government at that time. And by sitting on it, Pilate transforms any room or any street into his courtroom. It's from this place that Pilate will render decisions. And perhaps Pilate's thinking, you know what, how many times have I sat here before? How many stories have I heard? How many pleas have I received? How many wide eyes have stared at me, pleading for mercy, just begging for an acquittal? But I'm thinking that Pilate is looking at Jesus and saying, this Nazarene, he's different. He's calm. He's silent. His eyes, they don't dart back and forth. He doesn't scream. Pilate searches them for anxiety or for maybe even some anger coming from Jesus, but he doesn't see it. And perhaps what he finds might make him shift a little in his seat uncomfortably again, thinking, of all the people that I've ever been judge, jury, and executioner for, this man here, he's not angry with me. He doesn't even seem to be afraid. He seems to understand. And Pilate's right, of course. Jesus isn't afraid. He isn't angry. He's not on the verge of panic because Jesus is not surprised. Jesus knows his hour, and this is his hour. And Pilate is probably appropriately curious because if Jesus is this leader, where are all of his followers? If he's this Messiah, then what does this guy intend to do? If he's a teacher, then why are so many of these religious leaders who are here in my courtroom so angry at a teacher? Pilate's also correct to question, what should I do with Jesus, the one called the Christ? You see, church, these are urgent circumstances for Pilate, and they require an immediate answer from him. And I'm thinking that perhaps you, like Pilate, are curious about this man, Jesus. Maybe you, like Pilate, are puzzled by his claims and perhaps stirred by his passions. Maybe that's what's brought you here today. And you've heard all the stories. You heard about God descending from the stars and cocooning in flesh and basically placing a stake of truth in the globe. And maybe you, like Pilate, have heard all the other speaks, and now you want him to speak. Because what do you do with a man who claims to be God but hates religion? What do you do with a man who claims to be a savior but condemns entire religious systems? What do you do with a man who knows the very place and time of his death but goes there anyway? You see, Pilate's question is perhaps your question too. What will I do with this man Jesus? And church, it's a question whose answer cannot be avoided. Because you have two choices. You can reject him. That's certainly an option. You can, as many have, decide that the idea of God becoming a carpenter is just way too strange and bizarre for you. And if so, you can just simply walk away. Or you can accept him. You can journey with him. You can listen for his voice amidst the hundreds of voices that we hear every day and choose to follow Jesus. Pilate could have. He heard many voices that day. He could have heard and listened to Christ's. And had Pilate chosen to do that and choose to listen to this bruised Messiah who was his Messiah too, his story would have been completely different. But Pilate, as we know, vacillates. He's like a puppy hearing two voices from two different masters. And so he steps toward one, then stops, and then hears the other one and steps toward the other, because we know 4 times Pilate tries to set Jesus free. And 4 times Pilate was persuaded to the contrary. He tries to give the people Jesus, but they want Barabbas instead. He sends Jesus to the whipping post, but they want Jesus sent to Golgotha, to Calvary. He states that he finds nothing wrong against this particular man, but they accuse Pilate of violating the law. Pilate, afraid of who Jesus might be, tries one final time to release him. But the Jews accuse him of betraying Caesar. For Pilate, there were so many voices going on that day. The voice of compromise, the voice of expedience, the voice of politics, the voice of conscience, and then the soft, firm voice of Jesus Christ, who John quotes in John chapter 19, verse 11, "The only power you have over me is the power given to you by God." For Pilate, Jesus' voice must have been distinct that day, unique. Because Jesus didn't cajole or plead. He just states the case. Pilate thought that he could avoid having to make a choice, so he washes his hands of Jesus. He climbed up onto the fence and basically sat down on its middle. But in not making a choice, Pilate actually did make a choice. Rather than ask for God's grace, which he could have done, he avoids malevolence, which he thinks is now brewing. Rather than inviting Jesus to stay, he sends him away. Rather than hearing Christ's voice, he hears the voice of the people. Legend has it that Pilate's wife actually became a believer. And there's also a legend that has it that Pilate's eternal home is this mountain lake where he daily surfaces, plunging his hands into the water, seeking forgiveness. Forever and ever, trying to wash away his guilt. Not for the evil that he did, but for the kindness that he did not do. So, what should I do with this Jesus? Pilate asked it first, but we've all asked it since. Because it's a fair question. It's a necessary question. What do you do with Jesus? He called himself God, but he wore the clothes of man. He called himself the Messiah, but never, ever commanded an army. He was regarded as a king, but his only crown was twisted thorns. People revered him as regal, yet his only robe was stitched with mockery. It's a small wonder then that Pilate was confused and puzzled by this man standing in front of him. How do you explain him? Well, one way may be to take a walk with him. Take a walk with Jesus, his final walk. Follow his steps. Stand in his shadow. Go from Jericho to Jerusalem, or from the temple to the garden, or from the garden to the trial, or from Pilate's palace to Golgotha's cross. Watch Jesus walk angrily to the temple, overturning the money changers that were there, making a mockery of worship, wearily walking to Gethsemane, absorbed with what he knew he was going to be facing, and yet asking God, if there is any other way to accomplish his will, please take this particular cup away from me. And then we can, in our mind's eye, watch him walk painfully down the Via Dolorosa, and then powerfully, like this morning, out of the vacated tomb. And as you witness Jesus' walk, reflect on your own, because all of us have our own walk to Jerusalem, our own path through hollow religion from time to time, our own journey down narrow paths that just lead to rejection. And each of us, like Pilate, must cast a verdict. You see, Pilate heard the voice of the people and let Jesus walk the road alone. Will you? I hope that permanently planted somewhere in your soul, church, is the moment that the Father first stirred within you and within your darkness and then led you down a path to freedom. Because most of you who are here are Christians. There was that moment, that seminal moment, when you knew who this man was, who Jesus was. And it's a memory, I think, kind of like no other. Because when he sets you free, he truly, truly sets you free. That's how it happened for me. It was in a small Bible class in an LA suburb where I grew up. And when I think back on it, I don't know what was more remarkable at the time, that a teacher was trying to teach the book of Romans to a bunch of rambunctious teenagers, or that I remember what he actually said. You know, the classroom was kind of mid-sized for a church, one of half a dozen or so classrooms that were there at that church, the Imperial Highway Church of Christ in Downey, California. My desk had some carvings on it like kids would do, gum underneath it, of course. 10 or so of us were in this room where we all sat in the back because we were way too sophisticated to sit in the front and appear to actually be interested. And the teacher, as I recall, was this really earnest man. And I can still see his flat top because he was an ex-Marine. He had this little skinny tie that would stop right at the top of his belt. He had this kind of reddish hair and almost kind of like an orange complexion, but he had this soft voice and a really kind smile. And though this teacher was hopelessly out of touch with 70s teenagers, The shame for me as the teenager was he didn't know he was out of touch. But he didn't care, because his notes are stacked on this little table underneath this really heavy, black, very well-used Bible. And he speaks with a real genuine passion. And he's not really a dramatic man. He's not even a terribly big man. But that day, he was a fervent man. It's like he was on a mission, at least in my head. His text was Romans chapter 6. And the blackboard was littered with long words and diagrams. But somewhere in the process of describing how Jesus went into the tomb and came back out, it happened. I didn't see a moral code. I didn't see a church even. I didn't see the 10 Commandments. I didn't see hellish demons. I saw my Father enter my teenage life, awaken me from my stupor, and gently guide me, probably carry me, to freedom. You know, church, I said nothing to my teacher. I said nothing to my friends. I'm not even sure if I said anything to God, because I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to do. But for all I didn't know, there was one fact of which I was absolutely, positively convinced and sure of. I wanted to be with Jesus. So I told my parents that I was ready to give my life to God. I'm not sure that my parents were completely convinced, so they asked me a few questions and what I knew about the decision that I was going to be making. I told them Jesus was in heaven and I wanted to be there. And for my folks, that was good enough. And to this one day, I wonder if my love has ever been as pure as it was that very first hour. I mean, I long sometimes for the certainty of that newborn faith. Had you told me that Jesus was in hell at the time, I would have followed him. Public confession and baptism came naturally for me. You see, when your Father comes to deliver you out of your bondage, you don't ask questions. You obey instructions. You take his hand, you walk the path, you leave the bondage behind, and you never forget. And I hope if you can recall that moment in your life as a Christian, I hope that you never forget those first steps of your walk. And I hope that you won't forget the final steps of Jesus' walk from Jericho to Jerusalem, because it was on that walk that he promised you and me our freedom. And don't forget that final walk through the Temple of Jerusalem. It was on that walk that he denounced a hollow, empty religion. Or his final walk to the Mount of Olives, because it was there that he promised to return and take you and me home. Or his final walk from Pilate's palace to Golgotha's cross. Bare, bloody feet struggling up a stony, narrow path, but just as vivid as the pain of the beam across his raw back must have been to him was his vision of you and him walking together. You could see the hour he would come into your life, into your dark place to stir you out of your sleep and then guide you to freedom. So, church, what will you do with Jesus? C.S. Lewis, in his book, Mere Christianity, had this to say about that very question, and I'm quoting, "I'm trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him," referring to Jesus. "I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That is one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on the level with a man who says he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let none of us come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that option open to us. He did not intend to. And church, although the question still remains, what are you going to do with Jesus? This walk isn't over. The journey's not complete. There's one more walk that must be made. Because Jesus promised, I will be coming back. And to prove it, he ripped the temple curtain in half and split open the doors of a tomb so that he could do that very thing. Church, Jesus is coming back to claim his own. Will he be coming back for you? I guess the answer to that question depends on what will you do with Jesus. If Christ was not raised from the dead, this is just a happy gathering of people who are completely looking for a way out and an excuse. There is no other religion that claims that its Messiah did the things that Jesus did, was entombed for 3 days, and rose from the dead. If that is a lie and that didn't happen, we are fooling ourselves. But church, if it did, then the question is, what are you going to do with a man who could raise others from the dead, and his Father could raise him too, so that he would never die again, so that you and I could be living with him forever? What will you do with Jesus? I can't answer that question for you. You're going to have to come to that conclusion yourself. I trust that because you're here, you've made a decision to follow Jesus, and that's a good one. But as you know, many people haven't. And so to the extent that you can encourage them to consider the question and arrive at an answer that would be in their eternal best interest. So whatever influence you can use, whether it's people with whom you work or people with whom you live or people that you just run into, be a light, be an answer. Because many people in this world are asking that same question, what are you going to do with Jesus? And they don't know how to answer it. Let you be the answer. Can you go to the next slide, Chrissy? So Jesus is calling. He's tenderly calling. Calling you, calling me, calling the world. Calling you because he cares and loves us. So what will you do with Jesus? I pray that it's answer the call. Let's stand and let's sing, please.